this section, we're going to go through the scene file menu in the camera. This is the first menu that comes up. You really need to understand how these image settings work and how they interrelate so that you can really understand the camera and paint it and make it look the way you want it to. So when you go into the scene file menu, first thing that comes up is scene select. There are 6 possible slots in the camera that you can store scene file information into. So when you choose to scene select, you will get the slot that you can choose from, F1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. On the prior Panasonic cameras, they had a dial, they had a wheel that you could swap between F1, F2, F3, whatever. This particular camera doesn't have that wheel, so we do it electronically with the file select. So you don't see the names of the scene files here, but you still can select from the 6 positions and choose, 1 or 3 or 5. Oh, we'll choose 5 here. When you choose that, it will load up the scene file settings that are stored in slot 5 or whichever slot you've chosen. And now when you make changes, you'll be changing that scene file and only that scene file, slot 5. So yes, you do have 6 scene files, 6 looks preloaded in the camera that you can swap between instantly. Operation type, there are 2 different operation types potential. There's video cam and film cam. Thing to understand here is that choosing film cam does not make your video look like film. Choosing video cam does not make your video look like video. This changes the way that some of the functions operate. If you are more familiar with a film camera and you like that terminology, you like to think of the sensitivity of your camera in terms of ISO instead of terms of decibels of gain. If you like to choose variable frame rates or some of the other features that are available in film camera mode, then you choose film cam. If you instead are used to working with a video camera, you want it to work like a video camera does, you want to have your decibels of gain instead of whatever this ISO thing is, then you can choose video camera. So for most of this, I'm going to choose film cam because, hey, it's largely sold as a digital cinema camera. I think most of us will be using it in film cam mode, but I'm letting you know that there are the 2 different menu items. You can make identical looking footage in both, but it just changes the way some of the functions are named, basically. It's an operational control, not really an actual function control. The camera has many different possible formats that it can record in. Primarily, those are 1080i, 1080p, and 720p in 50 Hz or 60 Hz mode. It doesn't have standard def. You cannot record standard def in the camera, but you can record in 1080 or 720, and there are also different levels of 1080i that you can record in. So starting at the top where you want to be, PH mode. That's where you want to be. Regardless of which particular flavor of PH mode you choose, and what frame rate you choose, PH is the highest quality mode that the camera can record in. Not only does it have the most allocated bandwidth in the codec, an average of 21 megabits up to 24 megabits, but it also has better quality audio. It has a higher audio sampling rate than some of the other modes, and it also has the ability to use uncompressed audio. And the only way you can get into 720 mode is in PH mode. And the only way you can get into variable frame rate mode is in PH mode. The only way you can get into 1080p, 24p, or 30p is PH mode. So real short, use PH. But if you're not going to use PH, if you for some reason you're shooting 1080i interlaced, 60i or 50i, and you really need to use a very low bandwidth codec, there are choices there. There's the HA mode, which is a pretty good mode, probably on par with HDV, maybe a little bit better than HDV. It's for 1080 60i only. And then there's HE. That only uses 6 megabits. HA uses 17. HE uses 6. So it's 1/3 the space of HA and almost 1/4 the space of PH mode. So if you need to record 12 continuous hours of something and it's a lockdown shot, HA mode would probably be fine. When you have more codec bandwidth allocated, the codec is more robust. The images that it records will be more pristine and with fewer artifacts. The less bandwidth that you allocate, the more likely that you will exceed the codec's ability to record the image accurately. And so you might start seeing blockiness and compression artifacts. Much more likely to happen in HE mode than they are in HA mode. More likely to happen in HA mode than they are in PH mode. The highest quality mode you can go into, as far as bandwidth goes, is PH mode, because it's, again, average 21 megabits up to 24. When you go into overcranking, if you're going to do variable frame rates, then it will actually expand the bit rate that it records into. So you won't be just limited to 21 megabits. You can actually go up to about 36 megabits if you're shooting 1080 60p. The more frames that you tell it to record, the more bandwidth it uses. So it's scaling up the bandwidth in accordance with the need that you have. Conversely, you cannot record those variable frame rate modes on a Class 4 card. Class 4 means it can only support a maximum of 4 megabytes per second, and PH mode exceeds that when it's in variable frame rate mode. So for variable frame rate, it requires a Class 6 card. You can only get to variable frame rate in the 1080 24p or 1080 30p modes, or if you have the camera set into a system frequency of 50 hertz instead of 59.94 hertz, then you'll have different choices in this menu. You will have PH 1080 25p and PH 1080 50i and 720 50p and 720 25p. All of those are available all in the same camera. We can change the system frequency, it's in there, but you can only have the 24p when you're in the 59.94 hertz mode. You can only have 25p when you're in 50 hertz mode. For the rest of this, we're going to choose 1080 24p. VFR stands for variable frame rate. This is only available if you are in film camera mode. If you choose video camera mode, you'll see that VFR mode just went gray. And when I try to get it, it says cannot set. That's because it's not available in this mode. If you ever see a gray menu item, it's not that there's anything wrong with your camera, it's that this feature is not available due to some other setting. You set something else. So now you got to try to think about what is it that I could have set that would turn off VFR mode. One is if you set operation type to video camera, it won't work. Second thing is, if we set our recording format to 1080 60i, VFR is still disabled because you cannot have variable frame rates in 60i or in 720 mode. And the third thing is, if you turn the SDI output to on and turn 24 PSF to on, then it will disable variable frame rates. For a lot of purposes, having variable frame rates disabled is pretty good. When variable frame rate recording is set to on, you cannot record audio. Even if you're recording at 24p at 24 frames per second or 25p at 25 frames per second, it won't record audio. So turning variable frame rate mode on when you don't need it is asking for a disaster to happen. Don't do it. Leave VFR off unless you are specifically doing some specific overcranking on that next shot or undercranking. And then as soon as you're done, turn it back off. And you can turn VFR mode on by using the dial on the back. When you set the frame rate, you can press that dial in, or you can change it here. When VFR mode is off, for whatever reason, whether it's disabled or I've set it off, then this next one, frame rate, cannot be set. When VFR mode is set to on, then frame rate is possible. There's almost 24 frame rates in there that you can choose from, ranging from as slow as 12 frames per second, all the way up to as fast as 60 frames per second. Now I gotta say that even though there's all these frame rates in there, there's pretty much one frame rate that everybody uses. They always immediately go to 60 and leave it there. Why? Because it makes the slowest slow motion. The faster the frame rate, the slower the motion when it's played back. The slower the frame rate, the faster the motion will be. So if you're shooting in 24p and you choose a frame rate of 12 frames per second, by having chosen 24p, you're telling the system, play back my frames at 24 frames per second. So if you shoot at 24 frames and play back 24 frames, you get live footage. Not necessarily the live look, but real-time footage. What takes a second to take place in the real world takes a second to film, will take a second to play back. But if you go varying the frame rate, you change that formula. So let's say we record at 60 frames per second. In 1 second, we will record 60 frames, but we set our playback to 30p, 1080 30p. That means it'll only play 30 frames back in 1 second. If I've recorded 60, that means it'll take me 2 seconds to play all those frames back. When I filmed it live, it took place in 1 second. So now I have a case of 2-to-1 slow motion. Or if I'm playing back in 24p, now it will take 2.5 seconds to play back those 60 frames. Now, if I had instead chosen 48 frames, now I'm back to the 2-to-1 ratio. If I had chosen 36 frames, now it's a 1.5-to-1 ratio. 1.5 times slow motion. I would advise you to play with these numbers because, yeah, 60 is the slowest and it's the most dramatic, but sometimes it just takes too darn long for anything to happen. 36 or 32 or 40, those are nice slow motion rates You can definitely tell that it's slow motion, but it's not punitively slow, so it takes forever. Like I say, there's over 20 frame rates in there. Play with them, because you may find that you like something other than just 60. On the other side here, when you get below 24, you start getting into the fast motion rates, 22, 21, 20, for example, 22 frames per second. That's a little bit slower capture rate than 24, which means when you play it back, it'll be a little bit faster than reality. When would you want to do this? I'll give you an example. Let's say you're hiring an aging action star. No names mentioned, but some of the guys who made a whole lot of money in the 80s and 90s, maybe they're not quite as fast as they used to be. So maybe you want to make them, you pay a lot of money for their name, you want to get some good fast action. Let's shoot them at 22 frames per second. When we play it back at 24, it'll look faster than they really are. Maybe they're older than that. We go to 21 frames per second. Whatever you need to do, there's options in there. You can go down to as low as 12 frames per second. 12 frames per second is going to be 2-to-1 fast motion, and it's pretty fast. And there's a way that we can cheat it using the shutter speed to even get more simulated frame rates in the slower frames. 18 frames per second, if you're doing something like the Keystone Cops, one of these old silent films, and when you watch them today, they play back too fast. That's because they were shot at 18 frames a second, and they're being projected at 24 frames per second. You can do the same thing. If you wanted to make a Keystone Cops look, you've got 18 frames a second. Just always remember, whenever you're using the variable frame rate function, you are not recording audio. Even when it's 24 frames at 24 frames, or 25 frames at 25, no audio. So if you're recording this footage, you got to be aware of that, and don't use variable frame rates unless you really mean it and you know that you're okay with not recording audio. There are a wide variety of shutter speeds in the camera, which we discuss in the physical section when we go to the shutter there. Between the fastest and slowest shutter speed, when you click over there, you'll find a shutter speed that has a decimal point in it. That shutter speed is called the synchro scan speed, and this is a special speed that is designed for maybe syncing up with a computer monitor, chasing the refresh rates. Or normally you would get this big ugly black band that scrolls up the monitor. You can chase that shutter speed and dial in a very, very precise shutter speed. You can change it in half-degree increments. What do the degrees mean? Okay, when you're in film camera mode, it shows up in terms of degrees. When you're in video camera mode, the synchro scan shows up as normal shutter speeds, fractions of a second. And right now it's set at 148. That's a common speed for those wanting to do a film-like look, because many film cameras have a default shutter speed of 1/48. Not necessarily all that useful with an MOS sensor camcorder, and I discussed that in the rolling shutter artifacts. Be aware of it, but here it is. If you need 1/48, you can get it through the synchro scan. It's not a regular shutter speed. You can choose 1/60th or you can choose 1/50th, but if you really truly just are aching for 1/48, you can get it through the synchro scan. And you can adjust that by 1,000th of a second increments. The longer you hold the button down, the faster you can scroll through here. Or if you're using the wheel on the back of the camera, you can adjust this in two ways. If you're in this menu, you adjust it by using the menu buttons up and down. If you're using the wheel on the back of the camera, you can hold the wheel in and push it up and down, and then it will very quickly, very rapidly advance through the synchro scan speeds. So we're going to go back to film camera mode. Instead of changing in terms of actual durations of a second, it changes in terms of angles, degrees, the degrees of a circle. If you think of a circle, 360 degrees forms an entire circle. So what would 180 degrees be? That would be a half a circle, a half of, like a half moon. You got a full circle, bam, half shutter. Why are we talking about this? Because in a film camera, that's what a film camera shutter is like. In a film camera is the simplest thing in the world, the simplest piece of equipment. It's a hole that light comes through, and the film is in there. And then there's this rotating disc, this shutter that rotates past, and that shutter has a certain amount of it blocked or opaque and a certain amount of it revealed. That revealed area, that open area, is called the shutter angle. Now, the way a film camera works and why it's a little bit different and why this has angles of degrees. On a film camera, that disc of what the shutter is meant to rotate exactly one time for every frame of film. The rotation is constant, and when that rotates and the opaque part comes over, that makes it safe for the film to advance to the next frame. The sprocket holes come in, grab the film, and move it down, and it goes into the next frame. And then when the open part comes back around, that's what exposes the film. That rotation is constant, one rotation for every frame. Well, if you speed up the film camera, and instead of shooting at 24 frames per second, you shoot at 48 frames per second, the film is moving through the camera twice as fast. So the shutter is spinning twice as fast in order to maintain that same ratio. That means that the actual exposure time that you're getting at 48 frames a second is half as much as at 24 frames per second, because the shutter is spinning twice as fast, that opening is coming and going twice as fast, only half as much light is getting through. So as you change the frame rate on a film camera, the exposure time changes too. Well, that's what this does. That's the whole point of this, is that when you establish a shutter angle and then you change your frame rate, the angle will stay constant. The exposure will stay relative to the frame rate, and the motion blur will be appropriate. Now, if you chose the other type of shutter, and you chose a fixed rate of 1/60th, and you're shooting 24p, you'll have basically filmish motion for your 24 frames per second. But then if you go to 60 frame overcranking, it won't look like film anymore, because the shutter is too long. It'll be too blurry. It'll be too smeary. A film camera would have exposed that 60 frames at about 1/120th of a second. So you could manually choose 1/120th and get the film-like look. But then when you go back to 24p, do you remember, did I change the shutter? How did I? You don't have to worry about that if you're using the SynchroScan with the film style shutter. So if you're doing filmic work, this is the way to go. Just be very careful, because as I talk about in the other section on CMOS sensors or on MOS sensors, certain shutter angles, certain shutter durations will interact with certain types of lights, like dimming LEDs or like certain fluorescents or HMIs, and you might end up with rolling bands in your footage. So you got to be careful with your shutter speed. When you're changing frame rates using the shutter angle, you really have not necessarily that much of an idea of what your shutter speed is. So you might run into trouble with that. Be aware, be careful. But if you're doing film-like work and you know what kind of lights you're using, and you know that it's not going to cause a problem, then this is a great way to always have film-like motion no matter what frame rate you've chosen. And 180 is a good rate. There's nothing sacred about 180 degrees, because I can tell you right now in my office I have 7 film cameras. I think one of them has a 180-degree shutter. The rest of them range from 144, 156, 172.8, 220, 240. One of them is 240 degrees. They all kind of look like film. Some's a little bit blurrier, some a bit more staccato. So there's nothing sacred about 180 degrees. A lot of people seem to like a slightly smoother look that they get from maybe 200 degrees. It's up to you, whatever you like. You can look at it on the monitor. That's a great thing about video. You don't have to wait for the film to get developed and come back to you. You can just actually see it. Now we're going to start talking about the menu items that actually control how the image looks. I recommend highly that you spend some time. Don't just listen to what I say and say, oh, what are the best settings? Well, I use this. Okay, great, I'm going with that. Because there is no such thing as the best settings. There is only the best for a particular circumstance. I mean, think about it. If there was one best setting, why would they bother with any of the others? They're all there for a reason. So be aware of what they do and experiment with them. Sometimes people pick up this camera and they use it just in the default mode and they say, ugh, I don't like the footage, that camera's no good. But they don't even begin to tap what the camera can do. Play with it, experiment with it. I have on DVX User many reports of people who have come back and said, wow, I didn't really like this camera all that much when I first picked it up, but now that I've dialed it in, I love it. Learn what the features do, decide what's important to you, prioritize these features and these image settings towards what you like and what you're shooting. Let's describe what they do, and some of these, like detail level, I'm going to describe what it acts like and also what it does, because those aren't the same thing. Detail level. This ranges from +7 to -7. What this basically is, to get it in a nutshell, this is a sharpness control. The higher you set it, the sharper your images will look. That's not really what it does, but that's basically what it acts like. Now what it does is it creates the perception of sharpness. It does not really change the resolution of the image. When you shoot in a 1080p and it's able to resolve a certain image, you're not going to make more image detail out of raising this. What you are going to do is you're going to change the contrast of the tiny fine details. Let me give you an example. If you were using Photoshop and you put some light gray text on a slightly darker gray background, and then you took the exact same font, exact same size, exact same resolution, but you put black text on a white background, which one of those is going to look sharper? Unquestionably, the black text on a white background is going to look much sharper, crisper, and clearer than this soft gray on this almost as soft gray. That's going to be very hard to tell the difference. That's because we perceive sharpness in terms of resolution, but also in contrast. The sharper the contrast, the bigger the difference between white and black, the sharper things look to us. Well, that's what the detail level function does. It will go in and find fine detail, fine areas where there's not very much contrast between them, and it will add contrast. It will add drop shadows. Sometimes in video editing, we'll put a title on something and it may not be that easy to read, so we put a drop shadow underneath it so that it shows up everywhere. That's what the detail level really does. It goes in and adds drop shadows around all this fine detail. It may sound like a great idea. Hey, detail is great. Let's turn that all the way up. Let's crank that up as far as we can get it, and we'll make sharp images. Well, the problem is, A, you're going to see this electronic edge enhancement all over your images, and it looks really fake and really video because film doesn't do that. The other thing is that it will really magnify the presence of noise, because the detail level function, it doesn't know the difference between true, legitimate, fine detail and noise. Because what is noise? Noise is a minor fluctuation at the pixel level, little individual pixels dancing up and down and crawling all around. It might look at that and say, hey, that's real detail. I bet you really want to see this. Let me add some drop shadows underneath everything. That's not what you want. If you're getting too noisy of an image, I'll tell you one place to really start looking at is your detail level. Now, where do you set the detail level for a decent, rational, reasonable level of performance? Some people are saying -6. I think that's too soft. Some say I run it at 0. I think that's a little edgy. I kind of like around -3, -4. That's just me. You decide where you want it. -3, -4 seems to be about the level where there's enough enhancement that we're really seeing all the sharpness the camera is really able to deliver, but there's not so much that it looks edgy. I think up around 0, we're starting to get to where I think it's a little bit edgy. But then again, it depends on what you're shooting, and it depends on how big the screen is that you're shooting for. If you're shooting for a great big theater screen, you don't want to add all this additional detail in there, because all those little drop shadows, they'll be much more visible. But if you're shooting for a little web video, a lot of detail can look great. It can look really sharp and fantastic because it's so small in comparison to the rest of the image. If you're trying to decide whether one is better than the other and you can't really decide, I would say err on the side of caution and go with the lesser detail, because you can always add sharpness in post, but you can never take it out once it's been added in camera. V-detail level. The exact same thing, except detail level does it on both the verticals and the horizontals. It will add shadows below or above lines, and it will add on the sides. V-detail level only does it on the verticals, and it's much milder. So -2 or so may be a good starting point. If you want the softest, most organic images you can get, crank it on down. If you think it looks a little too soft, crank it on up. If you're seeing a little bit of aliasing in your images, a little bit of stair-stepping on lines or whatever, you can minimize that by cranking it down a little bit. If you're looking for a starting point, start with -2 and go from there. Now there's 3 functions that work all together: detail level, V-detail level, and detail coring. Coring is another one of those that I can tell you what it sort of is, and then I'll tell you what it does. What it sort of is a noise control. The higher you set the coring, the less noise you'll have. The lower you set the coring, the more noise you may see. But the higher you set the coring, the softer your image gets. The lower you set it, the sharper your image gets. So, as with everything, there's going to be a trade-off in all of these. There is no one right answer. Now, coring doesn't really do a whole lot of overall softening to your image, but what it does in general is it sets a threshold for the detail level algorithm to decide whether it should put the drop shadows or not. The higher you set the coring, the more fine detail it will ignore. It's a threshold. The higher you set it, it'll leave this alone. And so that means that all the noise down there, it won't get the edge enhancement. And then it'll be much less visible. Even though the noise is still there, it doesn't draw your attention to it. So you would think, hey, let's crank the coring up. Well, not necessarily, because then you start to lose the good value and the good benefit of some of this edge enhancement. I mean, there's a reason video engineers developed this edge enhancement technology, is because it makes images look sharper, crisper, and better. So the higher you go, the more likely you're going to end up with plastic skin tones, for example, because it just mushes and smushes everything together. Some people have described it as kind of like an oil paint effect. You don't have crisp detail anywhere, you just have smears and smudges. It's not really that bad, but I'm just saying it's there. Now, another thing to consider. This is a very low noise camcorder in general. I mean, if you turn the detail level up to +7 and the V-detail level to +7 and you put it on Cine D Gamma, you might go, oh my gosh, that's a terribly noisy camcorder. But if you follow my recommendations, you're using detail level around -4 and you're using normal 2 matrix, you're going to have very, 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 very clean images. Almost no noise at all. That sounds great. That sounds wonderful, except for two things. Number one, film doesn't look that way. Go watch a film in the theater. You'll see a lot of grain and a lot of texture. It's part of the organic experience. When you take all noise out, you end up with a kind of a sterile, clinical look. Is that really what you're looking for? Not necessarily. I'm not saying noise is good, but just think about the texture that you're going for. But the second thing is, we're dealing with an 8-bit codec here, an 8-bit recording format. When there is no noise at all in the signal, an 8-bit codec will quantize colors together. It'll group them together because it's very efficient to compress that. So think about terms of a blue sky. You know, you got a sunset down here, and it's bright white down here, and it goes to a smooth blue. The higher you go, the smoother it gets. Well, the codec might say, well, you know, this blue and this blue, those two shades are so close, I'm going to just call them the same. Well, and actually, this blue and this blue, they're all the same. Let's just call that all the same. And then there will come a point where it says, okay, I can't call these two the same, so I'm going to cut that off, and I'm going to start a new group up here. Well, what you end up with is a light blue band, a medium blue band, a dark blue band. You get this banding effect. Your gradients are no longer smooth transitions. They're all clunky gradients. That's part and parcel of what an 8-bit codec will do to you. However, if there's a little noise in there, it helps prevent that from happening. The noise kind of crosses the lines and smooths things out, so you will find that you'll have a smoother transition. So not all noise is necessarily bad. A little bit of noise can help. So in general, those of you who are looking for a place to start with, maybe -2, maybe -3. Let's keep the core rank down a little bit, unless you're finding noise objectionable. If you find too much noise, then crank it up and find that right balance between having enough sharpness, enough of the good edge enhancement without having all this crawling noise and having the edge enhancement on the noise. This one is for color saturation. You can go from, at the minimum, reasonably saturated image to the maximum hyper-saturated image. Panasonics are known for having rich saturated color. At the default setting of 0, this is as much color as some other competing camera brands have at their absolute maximum. So you can turn it down. If you don't like super rich saturated colors, you can go all the way to -7. This is not black and white. There's still a lot of color in there. There's as much color at -7 as some cameras have at default. Or you can go all the way up to +7, and that's super saturated. One thing to consider when you're doing that, though, the more saturated that the colors are, the more potential there is for chroma clipping, being one of the color channels being likely to be clipping before the other ones do, which means you might get colored highlights. The lower you set the chroma level, the more similar those items will be. So I found that at 0, at the 0 level, you can go to about 80, 81, 82 IRE before the red channel starts clipping on skin tones. But if you set all the way down to -7, now you can run up to maybe 90, 91, 92 IRE before it starts clipping. So you can buy yourself some range in the highlights at the expense of having not as colorful an image in camera. Of course, you can boost the chroma in post. You may still run into the clipping issue, but it's far better to have less chroma on your image and no clipping and be able to fix that, because once something clips, it's gone forever. I kind of like a richly saturated colored image. I normally go with about +2, but I'll leave that up to you as to what you decide. Chroma phase is a way to paint the image on the green and purple axis. So the more negative you set it, the greener your image will get. The more plus you set it, the more magenta your image will get. If you're trying to compensate for a green cast in your lights, you can normally do that through white balance, but if you want to do it manually, you can paint the image a little bit on the purple to green axis with the chroma phase. I found that on the AF100s I've tested, 0 is pretty neutral, pretty reasonable. If you're properly white balanced, 0 looks pretty good. Color temp, A channel and B channel. I'm going to go down here for a second and show you that there are two. You may remember when we're talking about the switches that the white balance switch has the preset and then it has A and B. Well, this menu setting, there's one for A and there is one for B. This lets you paint the image on the red to blue axis. Okay? The more negative that you set it, the redder your image will get, or oranger, really. It's more towards orange. And the higher you set it, the more bluish your items will get. And there's quite a bit of control. Now, if you're trying to match certain other cameras, you may find that this is a valid setting to use. You may have to tweak the phase, you may have to tweak the master pedestal and some of these other things. But for example, if you're trying to get the DSLR look of like a Canon 5D, it has very, very reddish tones, especially to the skin tones and whatever. So we find that maybe -4, which is really quite a bit. But if you paint the image here with the right gamma and with maybe about a -4, you can come pretty close to matching the look of the Canon DSLRs like the 5D. If you want the best color accuracy, absolute perfectly accurate color representation, 0 is where you want to be. But you can make the image a little bit warmer. You know, sometimes when you're in cinematography, you're shooting an image of somebody and you're thinking, well, I just want it to look a little richer. So the cinematographer might reach for what we call a straw gel, which is a very mild orange gel, and put that over the light, and that just brings out a glow. It brings out a little bit more color in the skin. You can accomplish the same thing by using this, going down to -1, -2, somewhere like that. Or if you really like like we said, the DSLR look, you might go all the way to -4. And you can control that individually for A and B. So maybe you set up one of them for accuracy, the other one for interviews, whatever makes sense to you. Another example of a setting that seems like it does one thing, in actuality does something else. What it seems like is a contrast control. It goes down to -15. The lower you set it, the harsher the contrast will be. The blacker the dark sections of your image will be, the more of your shadows that will crush to black. If you set it too low, it will actually crush off image data. I've been talking about being careful to preserve image data going off the top, highlights like chroma clipping or overexposing. Well, you also have to worry about it on the bottom end too, and you can actually end up with really crushed shadows if you set the master pedestal too low. On the other hand, the higher you raise it, the softer the contrast will be. You won't ever really have a true black in your image once you start going in the positives. You know, you get about +3, 4, 5, you're going to start having very gray shadows. It's a very flat look. If it's what you're looking for, great. It's not really necessarily giving you more detail. Sometimes people think that, hey, I want to shoot for the absolute flattest look I can get in camera and then create my look in post. Okay, fine, but just realize that up above about 0, you're not creating more image data. All you're doing is flattening out and softening the image. You're actually losing dynamic range because you're not using the valid range that's down below that level. You know, you might end up with black levels that are 20 IRE or higher, and that means you've just wasted all that range from 0 up to 20. What should you set it to? Well, one way to tell is to put the lens cap on and put the spot meter on, the marker. And on a camera that's configured from the factory at 0, I usually find that that marker is saying 2%. Well, I don't really want 2% in pitch black. I want 0 at pitch black. So I normally set the master pedestal down to maybe -1, -2. That will crush down the noise a little bit because noise occurs in the black region more than anywhere else. As you set it lower, it will crush the noise down a little bit and it will take full advantage of the range of the camera. Plus, I generally like a contrastier image, but that's just me. If you like a flatter image, a softer image, maybe that serves your story better. Maybe what you're trying to do is a very soft image. If that's the case, maybe you want to raise the master pedestal a little bit. The camera has the ability to automatically adjust its iris. And if you have a lens that is compatible with that, you can put it into auto iris mode. It will generally try to adjust to what it thinks the best exposure is. However, you can tell it, I want brighter or darker images than that. So if the camera is consistently overexposing or consistently underexposing, you can tell it adapt by using this setting. Now you have up to +6 or -6 is your range. Each increment is about 1/6 of an f-stop. So if you go to -6, you're telling the system underexpose by 1 full stop. You know, figure out what you think it should be, but underexpose 1 full stop darker than that. And obviously +6 would be overexposed by a full stop, +3 would be overexposed by half a stop. You want to be careful when using this because you don't want to overexpose anything that you don't have to. If you have to err on one side or the other, you're safer to underexpose, and especially if you're using the Cine-like D gamma or even the Cine-like V gamma, you're a little safer to be underexposing than overexposing, but don't overdo it. Don't go too far or else you'll end up with just muddy, ugly, crushed footage. So in general, the system at 0 does a pretty decent job. DRS, dynamic range stretching. This is one of those features that people, when they first hear about, they're like, yes, let's use that. And I'm like, hold on, maybe not. Okay, DRS, what does it do? This is a dynamic range stretching feature. This is a way that you can cram more of the range of dark to light into the camera's range of black and white. You can fit more dynamic range into your screen with this. How does it do it? It does it in two ways. One, it yanks down the highlights aggressively. It's like a super knee circuit. It really pulls the highlights down. And then, conversely, it lifts up the shadows. It can gain up the shadows based on what level you use. Therein lies the drawback. Gaining up the shadows isn't magically creating more dynamic range. It's just making noisier shadows. You want to be careful when you use this function as to what level you set it at. 0 is off, and then there's 1, 2, and 3. On setting 1, it does the mildest of both. It brings in the highlights pretty far, and then it'll gain up the shadows maybe up to 3 decibels. Now, we've used this in external light scenes where it's outdoors, broad daylight, and it's a little bit tough to hold the shadows and to hold the sky in. This really does help to pull the sky in while only minimally affecting the shadows. If you need to use DRS, DRS1 is pretty safe. DRS2, it's noisier. It pretty much pulls in the highlights about the same, but it brings up substantially the noise in the shadows, maybe to 6 dB or 9 dB. Anyway, it's a lot. It really noises up the shadows. Starting with DRS2, there's a transition effect. There's a halo kind of effect. You'll see when we show a grayscale chart that when DRS is off, the transition from light gray to medium gray to dark gray, it looks exactly like what you would expect it to be. It's light gray, medium gray, dark gray. But when you put DRS on DRS1, it's okay. DRS2, you start to see this ringed shadow effect that is happening. The system is actually creating this halo or shadow here. And when you go to DRS3, it's even more pronounced. And DRS3 can add up to 18 decibels of gain into your shadows. Very, very, very noisy. Now, I'll tell you what, when you're playing around and looking at it on the LCD, it looks fantastic. You can't see the noise in the LCD, and you're like, wow, look how great this is. This really brought back my image. Don't buy into it until you look at it on your TV. Get your 46-inch LCD or 62-inch plasma and look at what it really looks like. You might see a lot of noise in there that you might be disappointed in. DRS1, pretty safe. 2 and 3, you better need it before you use it. It's like any gain. It's a good feature. It's good that it's there, but don't just stick it on and leave it on. Leave it off unless you really need it. Now, here's some other things about it. It's an automatic function. Like all automatic functions, it adapts based on what it thinks is the best. It doesn't automatically lift all the shadows. It only lifts the shadows that it thinks are too dark. It doesn't automatically yank down all the highlights. It only brings down the areas that it thinks is appropriate to do that in. It's not exactly on a pixel for pixel level, but it's almost like that. I don't know exactly what the ratio is, maybe 4 by 4 pixels or whatever, but it evaluates each segment of the frame individually and raises or lowers it. It's like having a million irises or a million different apertures all over the frame. But if you change things on purpose, let's say you're changing lighting and you decide that you want a stronger contrast ratio, so you bring up a higher key light. Well, that'll make your shadows darker. That's what you want. But DRS might decide, hey, wait a minute, those shadows are too dark. So it'll gain up your shadows and restore what it thinks the contrast ratio is. So you might be like, I didn't want that. I want more contrast. So you bring up more, and it fights you more. Here's the type of scenario where I think it would be appropriate. Maybe you're shooting an open-air stadium. So all the people sitting in the stadium are in shadows, and the sky is white sky, and you can't get both. In that kind of a case, maybe you reach for DRS2 or 3 so you can at least get the shot. And if you have too much noise in your shot, maybe you can post-process that out. There's a plugin called Neat Video. It's available for many of the major nonlinear editing applications, and it's sometimes pretty darn magical. So if you absolutely have to save a shot with DRS and it's too noisy to use as is, maybe you can put in some noise reduction. I think it's better just to not have the problem in the first place. I'd rather light a scene appropriately because DRS doesn't create something out of nothing. It uses what you've got. However, outdoors for controlling clipped highlights, DRS1, it's not bad. It's fairly safe to use. I do endorse it when you need it, but I think you should leave DRS off unless you need it. There are 7 gamma curves in the camera, and what these control is the way that the camera distributes the range of black to white. So when you look at the IRE scale, the brightness scale, we have 0 to 109, and that is from pitch black to pure white. Well, then if we actually look at the brightness of a scene, Technically, you should have from no light to full light. And so the camera should match no light to full light on its brightness scale on the vertical of 0 to 110. Obviously, no light should be 0 and maximum light should be 110. So you would think you would see a perfectly linear 45-degree slope. That's what you would think perfect rendition should be. And that doesn't really happen anywhere for a number of reasons. Your usual gamma curve is going to have a slow lead in, so the shadows are going to stay darker longer or be rendered by the camera darker than they actually are in real life. And then there will be a rise, a quick rise in the midtones where it actually makes things brighter than that 45-degree angle. It'll bring them up, and then it'll kind of end out at the end. It'll kind of catch up and roll off the highlights until you reach the top. So there's a little bit of an S-curve, not a true S-curve like film has, but sort of a little bit of a curve. Usually there's always a hump there in the midtones. That's how gamma curves work. Part of the reason why they're this way is because back when CRT monitors, cathode ray tube monitors, were a big deal, they had sort of a built-in inverse gamma. They got started really slow and they would have a very low ramp up. And so the video cameras were designed to compensate by making them higher, and so when you put the two together, they would net out at about 45 degrees. Not necessarily necessary anymore now that we're all moved over to LCDs and plasmas and all the other technologies, but it is just the way video is. It's what we've always had. It's what we deal with. So when you're looking at creating video images, HD norm, that's normal gamma. This creates the most accurate, lifelike HD images. This is the most accurate for creating Rec. 709 HD TV. It has a medium level of noise. When you combine this with the normal matrix and normal chroma levels, you can make very, very, very accurate looking images. If ultimate accuracy is your goal, this is where you should go. If you're going for a look or a feeling, maybe not. But if you want perfect accuracy, or you're matching up with other manufacturers and everybody's all set to record Rec. 709, this is the place to start. SD norm is the same gamma curve that is in the standard def DVX100 camera, the Panasonic DVX100. It matches Rec. 601. It's basically just a normal gamma curve. There's not a lot of difference. There's a little minor difference in the midtone curve, but they're very, very similar. You also have over here low and high. The low gamma curve is designed to preserve the lower sections of the image a little bit better. So it lifts up the lows a little bit, just a little bit. Through the midtones, it's a little bit darker. Just a little bit darker, and then its highlights are about the same as HD norm. So the idea here is you could open up the iris just a little bit, and this lower gamma curve will then move up to normal, and so now you're getting a little bit more light in, and you're preserving the shadows a little bit more. High gamma is pretty much the exact opposite. It's for preserving highlights. It's the brightest gamma of the bunch. If you're in really low light circumstances and you're putting on all the gain you can and you need just a little bit more oomph, high will get you just a little bit more. It's designed to preserve the highlights, so everything is a little bit brighter, which lets you iris down a little, and then that preserves a little bit more of the highlights coming in without them being clipped. So those are the four normal gammas, and they all look pretty much the same. The differences are very, very minor. Of those, HD norm is probably the most used. Then we go to these three gammas, which are kind of in a different class. These are the filmmaker gammas. These are what we use enormously. B press is for black press. This is a higher contrast version of HD norm. It has more crushed shadows, it has sharper contrast, and it feels like it has a little bit less noise in there. Maybe the lowest noise of all the gammas. So if you are a noise freak and you just want to make sure there's no noise anywhere, lower your detail level, raise up your coring, and go to B press gamma. But it's still a video looking gamma. Then we have Cine D and Cine V. These two gammas are radically different from any other. Play with it, put it on your camera, swap out from black press over to Cine D. Huge difference. The idea here is not to conform with the normal video gamma. It's to be more of a film style gamma, more of a linear curve instead of worrying about trying to compensate for a monitor or something like that. So Cine D is the flattest gamma curve in the camera. It provides the most dynamic range. The D in that name is for dynamic range. You can hold on to the highlights longer in Cine D than in any of the other gammas. You have the longest reach from the darkest point to the highest point. It stores the most dynamic range. It is, conversely, the flattest and softest looking of the gammas, and probably the noisiest. If you hate noise, you're not necessarily going to like Cine D all that much. But if you want a film-like look, and you're going to be grading in post, and you want to preserve as much information as possible, Cine D is a great place to start. Cine V is very similar, but it's more optimized for a video screen. It's more optimized to have a little bit of a curve through the middle. It's a contrast to your curve. It's also a lot lower noise curve. So if you want a film-like look for indoors, for video release, Cine V is great for that. If you're looking for shooting outdoors and you need to preserve the maximum dynamic range, maybe you want to go with Cine D. Neither Cine V or Cine D allow the knee to work. So we'll talk about the knee in a second there, but it's a way that you can control your highlight roll-off. Those are available in the first 5 gammas, but not in Cine D or Cine V. Knee may or may not be present. It's controlled by whether you're in a Cine Gamma or not. If you're in a Cine Gamma, then knee is not selectable. If you're in a normal gamma, HD norm, SD norm, low, high, or B press, then the knee is selectable. With the master pedestal, you have this gamma curve that's going through, and you have a little bit of control over how the darks respond, whether they're lifted up or crushed down. That gives you a little bit of contrast control and a way to play with the gamma curve. The knee is sort of a little bit like that up at the top. Up the top, you can control the shape of how the highlights roll off. Let's assume there was no knee whatsoever, such as in the case of the Cine D gamma. As the brightness increases, as an image is brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter, then we have our scale of 0 to 109. The brightness will increase, the numbers will go up as the brightness increases right until they hit the absolute limit up at 109. And then, bam, there's a ceiling. There's just a hard roof that any brighter, it will just be clipped and cut off. It really looks ugly. Whereas with the knee, you can set a point. So instead of at 109, we could set down here maybe at 100. And we could say, hey, when you hit the 100 level, start rolling off. Don't slam straight into the ceiling. Roll off and slowly hit there. So it compresses the highlights. It grabs the highlights and yanks them down a little bit. So it creates a smoother transition. When you set it on high, it starts at about 100 IRE. When you set it on mid, it starts about 90. When you set it on low, it starts about 80. So as the brightness is coming up, it might start really low here and roll off instead of coming all the way up and then sharply jutting off like it would on high. So you've got 3 potential settings which let you choose where the roll-off point is, and then you also have auto. Auto is a 4-letter word. I mean, it's another 4-letter word. It will change on you automatically, and you might end up with fluctuations or flickering in your highlights if it's fighting between 2 different settings. I don't use it. I don't trust it. I would rather have it set on low, mid, or high, depending on how I like my highlight roll-offs to go. The higher you set it, the more natural and linear the brightness will be, but the closer it will run into overexposure. Whereas the lower you set it, the more it will roll off those highlights, and it really affects the transition from low to high. So you can get the idea that you're having a little bit more dynamic range by setting it on low. However, it doesn't really create that much more. You are actually going to have more dynamic range in Cine D, even though it doesn't have a knee, there's no adjustability there, than you will if you used HD norm and you set the knee on low. There's no protection. You're not looking out for you. It's not compressing the highlights for you, whereas the knee actually would. The matrix is a color matrix. It's another way that you can paint the camera. It doesn't let you go in and individually control the colors, but you get to choose from 4 palettes, 4 different color palettes. So you have Norm 1, Norm 2, Fluorescent, and Cine-like. The Norm 1 matrix is for accurate color representation. When you're looking at a color chart and you have your HD norm gamma and you got your Norm 1 matrix, it could be very, very, very accurate to what your eyes see. Norm 2 is a little bit different. The color's a little bit brighter. It's just a different looking color matrix. Maybe more appropriate for how PAL television works than NTSC. But there's a huge difference between these two in the terms of the visible noise. If you want the lowest noise, cleanest images possible, Norm 2 is much lower in noise than Norm 1, or especially than Cine. Cine is extremely noisy. If you're having troubles with your footage and you think it just looks really, really, really noisy, consider using Norm 2 instead. It's not a magic bullet. I mean, you have to factor in your detail level and everything else, but Norm 2 is definitely a lot cleaner, and Fluorescent is a little cleaner. If I was going to rank the palettes, I would say definitely Norm 2 is the cleanest. Norm 1 and Fluorescent are about the same, and then Cine is far and away the noisiest. But in terms of general color, Norm 1 is the most accurate. Norm 2 is just a little different. It's a different palette. It's a different flavor, but it's a lot lower noise. Fluorescent in general is about the same as Norm 1, except certain colors are quite boosted up. So you'll find that in the realm of the greens, it doesn't boost it, but in all the other colors, it's just a brighter, more saturated palette. The idea being that fluorescent lights, especially the older fluorescent lights, before we had the wonderful inventions of movie-compatible lights with high color rendering index, we had the old, horrible office fluorescent lights that would give a horrible, sickly, nasty, pasty, zombie-looking texture to the skin. Nobody likes shooting under those. Well, this compensates a little bit because it boosts all the other colors other than green. And those old lights had more green in their spectrum. So by the time you put the two together, the green light with the low green matrix, you ended up with a pretty decent looking look. That's not the only reason to use fluorescent. You may just like the palette, or you may like the effect it gives on skins because it has more enhancement in the reds and in the other areas of the spectrum, and that can give you a little bit richer skin tones if that's what you're looking for. And the final matrix is Cine. This is the Wizard of Oz Technicolor matrix. This is just bam, this is a lot of color. It's about equivalent to taking the chroma level up to +2 or +3. It really is a lot of saturated color. If you want the most eye-popping color you can get out of one of these cameras, go ahead and crank your chroma level up to +7 and then put it in Cine Matrix, and you're gonna have a lot of color in there. Only real downside to Cine is the potential for chroma clipping is more because the more saturated the colors are, the more they can run into clipping, and so you have to keep an eye on your levels and don't let your levels clip. And there's no way to measure individual color channels. You just got to really make sure that you keep below 80 IRE or whatever on anything that you're worried about that might be clipping because the individual channels might clip. The other thing about it is that, yeah, it's noisy. It's probably the noisiest of the gamma curves. So evaluate it based on how you like the overall look of the image. Maybe you can get where you want to go with high coring and Cine, or maybe you want a really low noise image but very sharp, so maybe you go low coring and Norm 2. It all works together. Norm 1 for the most accurate, Norm 2 for the lowest noise. This is a function that is designed to make skin tones more flattering, especially for people who have defects on their skin. When they start getting the gray hair, then sometimes, you know, some of this doesn't look so good. So what it does is it takes the edge enhancement algorithm that we talked about in detail level, where it goes through and it draws outlines around all the fine detail, including around the noise, and it turns that off for anything that it feels that it judges to be in the realm of a skin tone. So what you end up with, I'll exaggerate a little bit, but it's almost like if you took a normal person before they've been photoshopped and airbrushed. You know, when they do a magazine cover and they bring these girls in and they put it in post, they take the photo and then they go in post and they just they airbrush the whole darn thing and they make it look like something totally smooth and different versus what the skin really looked like. That's kind of the difference that you'll get when you turn skin tone detail on. It will soften and smooth out all the skin. Maybe it would be a quite kind thing to do if you're interviewing maybe somebody who's older or who doesn't have the best skin tone, the best texture, maybe they've got acne or whatever. This will help minimize that. The other possible thing though that can happen, the downside to it, is that it can make things look a little airbrushed and not quite as authentic or legitimate. Whereas if you turn it off, then you're just left with your normal detail level and coring, and that will apply to the skin equally to everything else. Black and white mode. It takes all the color out of the image, but certain color options that you change will still affect the image. So if you change the color matrix, you will still see tonality differences in the black and white image. That does still apply. It just won't actually have any actual color in the image. Card read and card write. This is how you can save or load scene files onto the memory card. So let's save the scene files on the memory card. Now remember, we're talking about the scene file menu. Everything we talked about in here is the scene file menu. So all these things that we're affecting are saved to the memory card as a scene file. They're also saved to internal memory. The camera has the ability to store internal memory, but also be able to write those files out onto a memory card, which is great for keeping a library of scene files or for sharing with another camera. If you're doing a multi-camera shoot and you want to configure all your cameras so they look the same, save your scene files out, give it to another guy, have him load those into his camera, and his camera, and his camera. Now everybody's cameras all set the same. So you write the scene files into either the memory card in slot 1 or slot 2. And here you can set the name and choose which slot you're going to write into. There are 4 potential slots. You can save scene files 4 times on a memory card. Doesn't matter how big your memory card is, you only can save 4. That's all the system deals with. So it also doesn't matter how small your memory card is. You can use a 32 megabyte, tiny, tiny little SD card in comparison to the 64 gigabytes. It's 1/2000th the size, but it's still plenty big enough to store scene files. So you choose one of the slots that you want to save into, and then it will bring up an option to name the scene file. So you come in here and you write it out to the memory card. It tells you that it successfully did it. So now this card has scene files that I can now take to another camera. Or I can load those scene files in. Slot 1 is where we saved them, and it brings up that these grayed out ones, there's nothing in there. So I'll click them and it says there's no file. But if I go to the one that I just saved, you can see the text is in black, and it'll ask me, do I really want to read it? Yes, I want to read it. And so now I've restored all the scene files. This menu seems confusingly similar. This is load, save, and init. This means load and save or initialize from camcorder internal memory, not from the memory card, not from the removable SD card, but from the built-in memory. When I use card write or card read, it's storing all the scene files, all 6. So we talked earlier that we had the scene select, F1, F2, F3, F4, F5, F6. Those are 6 positions. This will store all of them on the memory card or read all of them. You cannot send just one out to a memory card or just load in one. You have to load in a package of all 6. The load, save, init, that's dealing with the individual scene file that you're working on. So whatever you set for scene select, if we're on F5, this will only affect the memory slot for F5. And you can load or save into that memory slot, or you can initialize it. So you can restore the factory default scene file for that particular slot. So let's go ahead and do that. And now all those changes that I made all throughout, those are gone because it's restored the factory default, which is good. That means that feel free to experiment all you want because you're not going to lose what you originally had. You can always restore back to the initial with that menu command. Name Edit lets you assign a name to the individual scene file. So if you're creating a look that matches a Sony EX1, once you've created this, you may name the scene file EX1. So we'll go in the Name Edit here, and it's got its default name, but we'll go up here to EX1. And we'll pretend that I actually bothered to delete everything else here. And now I can save that scene file. Now, where does that scene file name show up? Nowhere. It's very frustrating. Okay, it does show up in one place. If you have your display set to all, then it'll show up in the name here if you have your other display. If you don't have other display set to all, you'll never see this name. But it will show up if you have all. That's also something that's kind of confusing for people. The default scene file for F6 is called CineD, and so they'll go into F6, they'll change the gamma to HD norm, and then when they come back out here, they see it says CineD, and they think it's still CineD gamma. No, it's the name of the scene file. Doesn't matter what gamma curve you had set, the name of the scene file was CineD. That's just the Panasonic factory default for that particular scene file, so don't be confused by that. So yes, you can save these names, and these scene files, as they're saved on the memory card, they're just text files. You could edit them with a computer using, Notepad or something like that. Bring it up and actually make changes if you wanted to. There's no hacking you can do, unfortunately, on this camera. We've found things you could change on prior cameras, but not on this one. So you can look at it and you could see the name of the scene file there, or you could copy and paste among different files to create one ultimate scene file package if that's what you wanted to do. They are just text files that are stored on the disk. And that is everything there is to know about the scene file menu.